Hey everyone, welcome to a beautiful day. Sending you lots of thoughts of peace and harmony and relaxation in your life. So I'm Dr. Julie, and I wanted to hop on here because a topic that I think is really timely is the role of the gut and stress in raising estrogen and what you can do about it, and also what to pay attention to. This is a big deal because, most people don't realize, but the stress response automatically creates an elevation in estrogen in the body. And for women, this is a huge deal because what happens is tissue estrogen keeps rising. And unfortunately, this doesn't show up in the blood. So you may be like many women who go to the doctor and then get told, your estrogen levels are normal or they're even low. And then that gets taken as gospel truth. But the reality is that tissue estrogen does not show up in the blood. And so many women are living lives with hyperestrogen situations and not having any idea that it's there. So you might have a lot of the symptoms like, being tired, having swelling, having sleep issues, having thyroid issues, having weight issues, metabolism issues. It may even be showing up in your gut issues. So one of the things I really want to talk about today is the relationship between the gut and estrogen levels, and the fact that the gut and the stress levels in the body and the changes it makes in the gut actually can promote really high estrogen. And it's often an under and very overlooked thing in the body. So in the gut, high estrogen can show up as having a lot of bloating, a lot of gasiness, a lot of inflammation, a lot of reactivity to foods. In the Chinese medicine model, the hyperestrogen state is going to show up as inflammation and pain in the body. So, it's strongly associated with a lot of stasis. And so you may find that your muscles are sore, you're stiff. You may find that you have difficulty if you're still having cycles. That hyperestrogen state is definitely going to show up as night sweats, as PMS, as associative clotting, as pain. And so, you listen to the list and most women can agree, oh man, we have an estrogen problem. But the problem is that it's so poorly addressed in medicine. So often I hear women saying, well, they put me on DIM, and DIM is an estrogen blocker, but it's not going to be sufficient, especially because the origin is the stress response, and the role that stress response plays on the organ systems. Gut and liver are hugely impacted, but the glandular systems aren't in isolation. So when we see elevated estrogen, we know, or symptoms of elevated estrogen, we know that the tissue is involved. And one of the ways that the tissue produces estrogen under stress is that's just it. It's actually part of the stress hormone cascade. There's a lot of reasons for that. So stress hormones play a role, right? They help us adapt in states of exacerbated response when we don't know what's going to happen next, or our nervous system feels like it has to be on high alert, and estrogen actually helps with mood elevation and blunting some of the effects of that stress state. But that doesn't mean that existing in a high estrogen state is a good thing, much like existing in a high cortisol state is not a good thing, but it does serve a purpose in the stress state. So I wanted to talk about the relationship here between estrogen and the gut. And just so the higher our estrogen goes, the lower our immune system function goes, because that's a big part of the stress response. There's also increased swelling, increased fibrosis, increased inflammation, more likelihood of actually having calcium deposits, more likelihood of seeing calcium being robbed from the bones because of the stress response cascade. So I'm not going to have a discussion right now about estrogen and bone health. And this is not a discussion about estrogen replacement. It's actually simply a discussion about tissue response, stress response, and the relationship to the gut. So if you are a human over 40, I guarantee you have a compromised gut. That's not, because everyone has, I'm not saying like you have a diagnosable gut issue, excuse me. I was trying to catch my words, but more so that we know that the state of the food supply, the state of the chronic stress state for humans is such that the gut cannot help but be impacted. Now, what happens there is that the higher the stress state, the lower your digestive capacity. So stomach acid goes down, bile production goes down, pancreatic enzymes go down. Then what happens is the food you're eating gets under-digested. So it doesn't get adequately put through all the processes that would allow all the necessary breaking of bonds between elements, etc., freeing up nutrients to be absorbed. It goes into the small intestine and you don't get the same absorptive capacity. There's also issues of a lot of then oxygen introduction. And this happens because we like a lot of aerated foods, whether you realize they're aerated or not. So, for example, homogenized milk is an aerated food. The way that they make it all be homogeneous is by putting it through high pressure screens that actually break the bonds in the fat molecules so that it ends up not separating into cream and milk. But the problem there is you introduce a whole lot of aeration in. Now you have oxygen entering the non-oxygen environment of the small intestine, as an example, and you end up with that's where some of the bacterial overgrowth happens. Just FYI, that's why so many people are having digestive issues, partly because we're getting all this oxygen introduction. We have the same issue with a lot of the way that because we're not digesting and often we're gulping, there's a lot of oxygen introduction there, but there's a lot of places where we're getting aeration into the intestines that further disrupts this already limited digestive capacity because of the stress response. Now, what happens over time is because we're getting limited digestive capacity, we're getting destruction of the tissues in the intestine. So they get inflamed because we're sending in tissue or food particles that weren't ready for that stage of the digestive system. And then we're getting inflammation, we're getting disruption of the bacterial balance, and then we're getting, most people have some degree of leaky gut. And really that's partially just a tissue integrity issue that again relates to the fact that stress response means that the body cannot put as much energy into tissue integrity, and you add on that limited digestion, now you've got this big problem. Well, what does this have to do with estrogen, right? Because this isn't necessarily a video about the gut. The issue with estrogen is this: the endotoxins produced by the gut bacteria, mind you, all gut bacteria produce endotoxin, the quote-unquote good gut bacteria and the quote-unquote bad gut bacteria. They all produce endotoxin. But in a body that is well-regulated and self-regulating, those endotoxin get easily processed by our liver, by the digestive system, so we don't have an issue. But in a body that is been compromised by the effects of stress, what happens is that those endotoxin then add to the inflammatory cascade in the body, and we see increased estrogen, we see increased ammonia, we see increased lactic acid. These are all pro-inflammatory problems, and the lactic acid and ammonia also are very disruptive to cell metabolism and the brain function. But when you have the increased estrogen, your body, can't process all of it through the liver because furthermore, the effects of stress are that the liver conjugation and ability to detoxify goes steadily down. So then we end up with a liver that's already functioning at suboptimal capacity, and it doesn't have the resources to do increased detoxification. So we end up with estrogen accumulation. Now, estrogen accumulation in the liver has a lot of consequence for diminished ability to detoxify, but also inflammation. But our body's wise. So it sees the excess estrogen, and what does it do? It kind of sequesters it into the tissues. This is how you end up with high tissue estrogen. And under the stress response, then those tissues, fat cells, will produce estrogen as well. So you have this sort of lose-lose scenario where the chronic state of stress develops situations in the gut and in the liver, which lead to estrogen production as a result of endotoxin exposure, that then causes high tissue estrogen high estrogen in the tissues. And then the resulting state of stress also enhances fat cell production of estrogen. Now you've got this elevated estrogen state at the tissues that is pro-inflammatory. It limits the immune system, blocks thyroid, pro-fibrosis, pro-pain. And so now suddenly you've got this problem. And this is where a lot of people are functioning from, men and women actually. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of men, just as a side note, that are showing all the signs of increased estrogen in terms of the way the fat's accumulating and even the gynecomastia, the development of what look like breasts. And furthermore, just their increased rates of heart disease, etc. But for women, what we see is it can show up a number of ways. And so there's often association here with difficult cycles and high estrogen. So a lot of women will note that when they had cycles, there was PMS, there was cramping, there was pain, there was clotting. Those are all high yield signs that there's high estrogen. Furthermore, if you've had cancerous changes anywhere in your body, you guys, you have to be concerned about elevated estrogen. Even if it was like a stage 1 or a precancerous issue, you have to consider that. So I just want you to know that you have to be aware that there's an estrogen issue and you cannot solve it by just taking DIM. Now, the other facet and place that we see it, of course, is slowed metabolism. Lots of sort of like fluid accumulation, toxic fat accumulation, brain fog, arthritic symptoms, pain symptoms, and also, sorry, I think there's like a hair on my nose. Also in calcium accumulation in places it's not supposed to be. So if you see bone spurs, maybe you've had an x-ray with a chiropractor and they've said, oh, there's a bone spur. Maybe you've actually had scans done to see what your arteries are doing and they see plaquing. These are all associated elements of the hyperestrogen in the tissue picture as well. So we need to be really paying attention to that. Now, you're wondering, like, what do I do? So first of all, with food, you have to be eating easy to digest foods with a good balance of easy to assimilate carbohydrates, because one of the big issues is the stress state is a low energy state. Your body does not have the capacity to produce enough cellular energy to keep you at a high state of function. That means you need easy to digest carbohydrates. This is a big issue. I am talking fruit. In some cases, I'm talking honey. Among my clients, you know, it is not uncommon that they have listed ice cream on their diet diaries, and I'm probably the one doc who's not going, why did you eat the ice cream? That's horrible. You know, that can actually be a very pro-metabolic, pro-estrogen lowering, pro-body restorative food. Same thing with, you know, having milk with sugar in it, maybe sugar and a little bit of salt. Having cooked squash, cooked sweet potato, having easy to digest carbohydrates is going to be essential. In fact, if you don't do that and you don't have them balanced, and that's one thing, it does need to be balanced for your constitution, which is not a one size fits all. So there's not like a one marker, hey, everybody do this. But you do need those foods there, and they need to be in greater proportion than the protein in your diet. So this is key, because when we eat diets where our protein far outweighs our carbohydrates, especially if we're, you know, not, this is not an exclusion, so let me just go there. If your proteins outweigh your carbohydrates, what happens is your cells must stay in that adaptive energy state, which is estrogen promoting, just FYI. So anybody doing that, even if they're not all the way to ketosis, but they're doing like a paleo that doesn't include much carbohydrate at all, that is the state you're promoting. It is of serious consequence to note that in that state, one of the first systems impacted is the immune system. I just want you to be very aware that the more stress we put on our body, the more it is going to show up in these systems. You know, think of the immune system, it's associated with the thymus gland. In the order of like glandular systems, you're coming up from the ovaries. Well, the thymus gland sits right before the thyroid. We've got massive thyroid issues, but in the Chinese medicine model, there's sort of an ascending order of impact. So just FYI, if you're seeing thyroid issues, you've already had thymus issues. If you're seeing adrenal issues, you're already on your way to digestive and thymus issues. So just, it's there. So you have to have sufficient, easy to digest, usable energy for your cells to use so that they don't go into the stress state and therefore produce more estrogen. Now, on top of that, it really is important that you also are working with the gut to avoid the gut inflammation. And one of the things is that all raw foods are very hard to digest. And I know this flies in the face of a lot of the information out there, but, you know, a lot of that information is ridiculous and awful. So one of the things that we need to do is make sure that you're not doing the salads. I know some of you are like shaking in your seat now, because I know how much people love their salad. And I know that we've been told that salad is like the quintessential health food, but it is not. It is terribly taxing to the digestive system. It is terribly taxing to the building of life force and vitality in your body. And it actually can be one of the huge ways that we create more of this problem. So no salad, no smoothies, you know, definitely don't be eating like the raw cruciferous vegetables. I've never understood how people do that anyway, but I know people do. You know, no raw kale salad, as if that was even digestible. You guys, those are not superfoods in that form. So that will further the gut irritation, the gut inflammation. It will make the problem worse. And so do not eat those foods. Stick to only cooked foods if you want to do your gut a favor and try to make an impact on this situation before it gets much worse. You also need to have something in place to balance hormones. Now, here's the tricky part. Because if you've not seen my progesterone video, go find it, because I've talked about progesterone before. But progesterone is the balancer to estrogen for sure, and it does decline with age and stress. So the one big thing is that the more we go into the stress response, the more estrogen dominant we become and the less progesterone that's available. Now, progesterone is anti-inflammatory and pro-metabolic and all these great things. However, if you have not dialed in the food so that your cells have the energy to be able to make the changes necessary, and you just start slathering on progesterone, or you start taking the progesterone promoting herbs, you guys are going to dig yourself into a hole. So initially you will feel better. I guarantee it. Well, for most people, some don't. But you will feel better. But the problem is you haven't changed the pattern at the cell, and you haven't made the cells sit into a rhythm where they can actually make the energy to support the increased metabolic rate and the easing out of the stress state. And eventually your body will have no choice but to go backwards into the pattern that created the problem in the first place, because you haven't changed the root. This is where knowing what your body's doing is specific and very important. And this is why you'll see I can't make like a one-size-fits-all plan, because it's different for everybody. But that progesterone has to be balanced. Now, it doesn't always mean taking progesterone. I will say, sometimes that involves using Chinese herb formulas specific to your constitution and to your organ network needs. Sometimes it's honestly happens just with the diet work and clear and, nourishing the organ systems all by itself. And in some cases, it does mean using progesterone. But these, the balance has to be there. And sometimes in order to get the estrogen to detox in some people, that is necessary, because I guarantee you the tissue estrogen does need to be quote unquote detoxed. But that again, so I'm going to really hit on this. Do not go and do something that someone says is going to be a detox of estrogen from your body. Please, 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 because your liver's not ready for it. If you're existing in the stress state, you are going to find that your liver cannot detoxify adequately. And so you start telling it to conjugate and process more estrogen. What's going to happen is it's going to do it incompletely. You're going to get estrogen reabsorbed into the bloodstream that's actually in a toxic form that is going to create more stress in the body. So I don't want you to go down that road. So I can't stress this enough. Do not go searching the internet for estrogen detox and go do those things. I am in no way advocating that, because it will create more problems. But it is essential that the balance be created. Now, as you've heard me say, the first step there is actually getting your body to be able to turn off the stress response. The first step is not balancing the hormones. The first step is not detoxifying them, but it is a step that will have to happen along the journey, which can only happen after the stress response has been turned off, the gut is decreasing production, and you've helped heal those organ systems. So that's why I say, like, food needs to be balanced. You need to be eating easy to digest stuff and not consuming salads. And then, you can start having that conversation about that level of issue. And then as you go, woven into it, is that the stress state is one of low vital force. And vital force is a term that's been used in naturopathy. I would say Chinese medicine just simply refers to it as qi. Other, homeopathic forces have used vital force for a long time. It is a term to quantify actually having life force in the body, which life force is the generator of the energy we experience, of the digestion we experience, of the sleep we experience. If you do not have that, then you have like a hollow shell. And this is one of the things. So we have to be cultivating vital force. Now, one of the hazards is I'll often be talking to someone and say, well, what do you think is going to cultivate more energy? And they start saying, well, if I exercised more, if I went to the gym more, if I lifted more weights. The problem there is that those are actually vital force consuming activities. So it is a weird thought loop, I think, that we've gotten into as a society, that if we exercise more, we're definitely generating more life force. It may temporarily generate energy. Some people are surprised to know that a lot of exercise actually ups your stress hormones. So some of that energy that you feel after you work out is actually stress hormones. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, if there isn't something in place to cultivate the real energy that's based off of solid cell-based, production of energy that is not stress hormone based, you will be in trouble. And that's where most people are. So that's why I'm not saying go out and exercise more and go do these things. There actually needs to be effort to understand which of your organ systems is kind of leading the charge in terms of the weakness, and then restore that. There's a couple ways to do that. So definitely it has to be based off of the patterns in your body. So that's, again, not a one size fits all. With my clients, I use healing techniques that they can use on themselves. Some of it is Qigong based. Some of it is elsewhere. It's from the naturopathic world. You know, some people can do this with acupuncture, but that's even hit or miss because it depends on how the acupuncturist uses things, and you're dependent on them to do it, which is ultimately, you know, we need to learn how to cultivate this in our daily life, and it has to be blended to what's happening in our organ systems. Chinese herbs can also be used, but again, has to be based on the patterning. And if you don't dial in the diet before you use the herbs, you're actually going to be in a world of hurt. So we need to make sure that all the systems are involved. And this is the thing. Estrogen is not just an ovary thing. It's not just an adrenal thing. It is a whole body issue. And it is a huge associative issue with the gut, but you still have to backtrack to what the nervous system is telling the gut to do. And that's where I think a lot of times the message gets muddy, because a lot of people go to the gut, but they haven't changed what's signaling the gut. So unfortunately, they're doing all this work on the gut, and then they're still getting the signal from the nervous system, and they haven't changed that. And unfortunately, that is not something, you guys, that gets solved by, oh, I did some deep breathing and learned how to meditate. I wish it was. This wouldn't be an issue, but unfortunately it does not. So Kelly, you're asking, relative to what you said, does increased protein post-menopause help with decline in estrogen levels? No. If you increase protein and you don't have sufficient carbohydrates in excess of what you're eating with protein, you're actually going to, well, yes, you're going to increase estrogen, but Kelly, that's going to be in a negative. So what's going to happen is you're going to increase the inflammatory forms of estrogen. And actually, most post-menopausal women need balance to all the glandular systems. And when you increase estrogen via stimulating the gut with that inflammatory cascade, you're stimulating a whole cascade of stuff that you do not want happening in your body. You're stimulating estrogen that would increase tumor growth. You're stimulating lactic acid that would increase cancer growth. You're stimulating ammonia that would increase cell death. You do not want to activate the stress hormone pathway. You can balance those systems by many other means, but I do not advocate in any way, because as soon as you go down the stress hormone cascade, which I guarantee you, I haven't yet met a woman who isn't living there, but as soon as you go down the stress hormone cascade, you have automatically shut down your immune system, shut down thyroid, shut down the gut, shut down the liver. You've already impacted all those things. So I would never advocate that as a means and a way to raise estrogen, because on the flip side, you're doing a whole lot of huge damage on the back end that I would think you wouldn't want to take on, because you cannot shut down that damage without diminishing the pathological estrogen production that's happening because of the stress response. But that's a good question. Hi, Debbie. It's good to see you here. It is good, you guys, to know what's happening in your body and where the state of that stress response is, because this is the thing. Our body cloaks it from us. It will purposefully kind of hide it, because in reality, I really do believe our body, in essence, wakes up every day and says, how can I serve you? And we hatch these plans, and very rarely are we sitting down. You're welcome, Kelly. Very rarely are we sitting down to ask our body, like, hey, what's really needed? Plus, we don't have the knowledge, right? We've distanced ourselves from so much of the basic knowledge of how our body actually functions, what actually nourishes it, how to balance foods. We've distance ourselves from that so much. We don't even have a food culture anymore, at least not in this country. And so what's happening is we just keep plugging along, because a lot of our societal basis for like things to be proud of are based off of achievement and doing and pushing and marshaling ourselves forward. And the problem is that although that can be great, if it is done at the detriment of our physiology, because we don't have anything in place to understand what's actually happening, this is why people keep getting blindsided by health challenges as they age. This is why so many women, say, it was all great until I hit perimenopause. The reality is it wasn't all great till you hit perimenopause. Your system was just cloaking it. And when you hit perimenopause, it was enough stress to tip the balance so that now you had to experience the totality of what had been happening the whole time. This is why we have to pay attention to this, because this is why we see such challenges in women as they age into 50s and 60s and 70s, because these inflammatory processes have been raging for 20 years and now they're just making it to the surface. And the problem is always way bigger than we realize. So taking these awarenesses of the role that estrogen plays and how it relates to the organ systems is so key, because you can start to actually head it off and make big inroads into that longevity, into that health picture over the long term. So I wanted you guys to have that, especially considering the role that stress plays in our immune system. It's a great topic to talk about and really start giving some attention to these deeper levels. What fuels it all, you know? So I hope you guys have a beautiful day. Thanks for being here, and definitely reach out if you have questions. And this is what we work on. My clients learn how to work on this and see the signs in their body and understand what's happening. And we test and evaluate and do all those things to be able to know the patterns. So if you are at a place where it's time to understand what's happening in your body, then shoot me a message and we'll set up some time to talk. Blessings, guys.